See that? All right, super. Okay, so as I was saying before, there is considerable space, both directly and indirectly, recognizing the importance of environmental issues generally, and references to protecting the environment in both obligations and exceptions. As I said before, the GPA is the key agreement, and I've laid out some of the areas where there's language. The preamble to the government procurement agreement, gives countries flexibility. Article 3 of the agreement includes an environmental exception to the provisions, which is modeled on the GATT exceptions, including the exceptions for protecting the environment. Article 10 really lays out the process for procurement specifications under the agreement, and that permits specifications that promote environmental protection and evaluating environmental characteristics as a criteria of tenders. And this approach has been replicated in free trade agreements, and we'll go through some examples of those. You also find environmental language in the preamble to the WTO agreement, which talks about the need to both protect and preserve the environment. And as I mentioned before, there are environmental exceptions to different disciplines. So for example, in the GATT, there are disciplines for most favored nation treatment and national treatment, and there are environmental exceptions for protecting the environment, human health, exhaustion of natural resources. There are also exceptions in the general agreement on trade and services. The SPS agreement, as I mentioned before. The TPT agreement actually carves out procurement and says procurement is not subject to this agreement, but also lists environment as a legitimate objective. And then going into a little more detail in Article 10 of the revised GPA, just want to go through the structure of it so you can get a sense, because this is replicated in other agreements. So it starts off by saying that procuring entities need to make sure they're not creating unnecessary obstacles to international trade. In prescribing the technical specifications for both goods and services being procured, you need to set out the technical specifications in terms of performance and functional requirements rather than design or descriptive characteristics, and base such specifications on international standards where they exist. Now, in terms of the explicit environmental provisions, Section 6 says for greater certainty, parties may prepare, adopt, or apply technical specifications to promote conservation of natural resources or protect the environment. So that's very explicit. And then in paragraph 9, the agreement provides that the evaluation criteria may include, among other things, environmental characteristics. And then Article 15, in terms of indirectly allowing for non-economic criteria to be part of the decision making, it notes that procurement agencies can award tenders based on the most advantageous tender, so not just strictly on price. So there are other things that they can look at. And just backing up to this slide, I think it's two things that's important to point out. Looking at performance and functionality versus design or descriptive characteristics. As a lawyer, that's something that you could argue either way. And a lot of that's going to be dependent on the facts of that particular measure. But that reference to international standard, that's a really important one. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, because that's essentially an invitation to develop an international standard to create something that is more likely to withstand scrutiny under the agreement. So if you can go to a body that develops standards in an open, transparent, impartial, consensus-based manner, and again, this has happened in some cases, and we can talk about that as well. That's going to help you be able to withstand scrutiny if there were to be a WTO challenge, and also to potentially avoid retaliation, because those kinds of bodies are going to have stakeholders from throughout the world in order to become a consensus standard. And then moving on and talking about how some of these provisions have been taken up in other agreements. This is a provision from the Canada-EU trade agreement, and you'll see very similar language with respect to allowing procuring entities to promote the conservation of natural resources or protect the environment. And there's a very similar provision in the Korea-Australia Free Trade Agreement, the EU-Singapore Trade Agreement. So again, we see this quite a bit. And there's also a joint interpretive statement by the EU and Canada that affirm parties' rights to use environmental criteria in procurement tenders. Similar language in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership and the US-Canada-Mexico Agreement. As you can see here, it's in paragraph 6, similar language, also USMCA Article 13. And here's more language in the exceptions for the CPTPP that measures are able to be taken to protect human, animal, or plant life or health. Again, I think hopefully everyone's in violent agreement that there are plenty of provisions here that would allow these measures to be taken under existing agreements. So I think we're starting off in a very good position. Now, the question is there policy space for doing that? Because these provisions have been there for quite some time. And I can tell you it's been a while since I was at USTR for a long time, and I was in the general counsel's office, and I had the regulatory portfolio. And so I would often review trade agreements and legislation and regulations with health and safety and environmental reasons behind them. And I think, at the time, generally speaking, we negotiated the trade agreements. And so as an institution, as a trade ministry, we're looking for market access. And one great way you promote market access is you don't want to have to deal with inconsistent measures on your own, right? Because when you're in the TBT committee or you're in a bilateral meeting and you're pressing the other country on a measure, you don't want them to point out a measure of yours in the same space that is potentially WTO inconsistent. And so generally speaking, a trade ministry is going to try, if there's ambiguity, generally speaking, they're going to push for that measure not to go forward or for that measure to be changed to make sure it fits squarely within the agreement, because we don't want to have to be dealing with defensive measures when we're pushing offensive market access interests. I think it's safe to say, and again, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the wrong way for a trade ministry to look at it, but I also think that the dynamics have clearly changed, probably within trade ministries, but also just in general in terms of, how that kind of input is factored into an interagency process. And I would guess that that's not just going to be the case in the U.S., but it's probably going to be the case in other sovereigns as well. As I note here, I probably don't need to go into too much detail on these issues, but the world has clearly changed in the last couple of years. There's a logjam at the WTO in terms of the ability to negotiate new agreements. And this has been going on for a long time. I remember when I left the general counsel's office and went to the WTO negotiation office at USTR, and I was one of the WTO negotiators. And I'm going to date myself now because I think this was 2007. And I remember our lead WTO negotiator telling me, there are going to be no more single undertakings. It's not going to be possible. We're going to need to do things on a sectoral basis if anything's going to happen. And he was right, clearly. And so things are going to have to be done probably outside of that realm. And I was listening to a panel that Sandra was actually on within the last few weeks at the WTO. And one of the panelists was talking about discussions under the GPA agreement to revise it since 2012. Those have been going on for 9 years. And China, clearly you need agreement among at least the US, the EU, and China, and probably others to move anything there. China isn't in the GPA, and they've still been discussing it for 9 years. So to really get a change there is going to take a long time, even in a plurilateral setting. So I think it's important to move in other places, especially because I do think that there is policy space to do that. The other thing to note is that WTO dispute settlement is inoperative and likely to be inoperative for a while. That is not an invitation for everyone to violate their WTO agreements. But I also think that that might provide some comfort for folks to explore what's possible within the existing commitments and exceptions that everyone has agreed to, or maybe there might have been a little hesitation before, because I do think there is room to do that. Obviously, climate crisis. No one on this call needs to go into more detail on that and how that's changed willingness of many governments to look at this. And the Biden administration has made efforts to integrate climate change, addressing climate change into the organizational missions of every single U.S. agency, not just regulators, but every agency. And they just put out plans recently in terms of how they're going to do that and ask for comment. And we've also seen major supply chain disruptions that may not go away anytime soon. I know right now in the U.S., there are at least 60 ships queuing off the coast of Southern California waiting to get into LA and Long Beach. That's been up to 71 at one point. And so certainly folks are seeing the benefits of shorter supply chains in terms of resiliency, but there's also a climate and sustainability aspect as well. Sustainability as a broad concept is clearly gaining favor, and I know we can talk about this a little bit later, but you know, in the U.S. Supply chain report that the administration came out with this summer, they mentioned that as something that they're going to be focusing on to achieve their supply chain goals. And they define sustainability in a very broad way, not just environmental sustainability, but also anti-forced labor, anti-corruption, a lot of different things. You know, I think, you know, another point that creates policy space here is that you can take a sustainability approach, a circularity approach to procurement as well as other government measures, and it will be less likely to lead to tit for tat retaliation. And the reason is because it's origin neutral. By nature, it's origin neutral. It's meant to deal with real problems that the world is facing, it's certainly going to be less provocative than a local content requirement or something like Buy America, which again the administration is clear that they're pursuing, but the reality is that the scope of that is going to be much smaller than potentially something like circularity and other origin neutral environmental preferences in procurement. I think that can make a much bigger difference in terms of both the environmental goals the administration is pursuing, as well as competitiveness goals. And clearly there's a very nice convergence now between the need to take measures for the environment and also the fact that it promotes competitiveness, where certain countries feel that their industries are more advanced in terms of innovating to promote environmental protection. Incorporating those kinds of provisions as preferences will give those companies an advantage. But again, I think it's important that while noting that that's going to be one of the effects, that should not be the reason for taking the measure. And you need to be careful in terms of how you discuss that, particularly publicly, because I can tell you as a trade lawyer, looking at potential market access issues, it was always a wonderful moment when I found a commerce minister or trade minister or some other minister or member of a legislative body in another country publicly saying that the reason for a particular measure was to help their domestic industry. That was a wonderful moment because then I would immediately cut and paste that statement into my brief or whatever I was doing, because that seemed to suggest that there was another reason besides the publicly stated reason. And there's no reason to do that here because there are very sound environmental reasons to do that. Obviously, there are going to be some constituents that will not be persuaded by that and will need to be persuaded by the fact that there'll be economic benefits, but it's very important to distinguish that as distinct from the objective, the real legitimate objective for taking these kinds of measures. So clearly there's policy space, And there are definitely ways that you can craft these measures to make them consistent with trade agreements and also less likely to lead to retaliation. Now let's talk about potential barriers. And let's talk about first the government procurement agreement and also some of the other agreements. So the way the GPA is structured is that there are disciplines, which we've already discussed, and then countries have schedules that, right, not everything in their procurement regime is subject to these provisions. They actually have to take commitments. And you determine what entities you're going to cover at both the central and subcentral government level, what goods and services and construction services are covered and which ones are not. And then the processes for procurement need to be transparent, there needs to be due process, and you can't discriminate. And as I mentioned before, discrimination based on origin of products, services, or suppliers, that's a red line that is going to raise concerns. But again, you don't necessarily need to do that in order to obtain your objective. An origin neutral environmental measure can, like, again, depending on, I have to be a lawyer here, depending on how it's structured, there are good reasons why that could potentially be met here. Even a local content requirement that may violate the government procurement agreement, there are environmental exceptions available, as we discussed earlier. And if you look at other agreements in the WTO space, you can see that there's a similar structure, but in many ways procurement is more preferable because if you look at some of these other agreements, if you distinguish among products based on circular economy criteria, it could be found to violate general non-discrimination disciplines, right? So if you have steel product A, steel product B, one is developed in a more sustainable process than another, likely that a WTO panel under one of these agreements is going to say, that's discriminatory, those are the same product. The fact that the process is different for developing it doesn't change the fact that it's the same product. Now, again, there are environmental exceptions available for that. And so you could qualify anyway. But one of the more interesting things is that the government procurement agreement appears to be less strict because it basically says that you can't discriminate based on origin, period. So it appears to allow more space for origin neutral requirements that might treat the same product differently based on the process. The other thing about the GPA is if you, it's obviously, much more onerous to withdraw commitments from your schedule. If you do that, you're going to have to provide reciprocal market access. You're going to have to make up for whatever market access you took back. There could be arbitration over that. As a government, you probably don't want to do that. But if you have an environmental provision, you don't have to alter your schedule. So there are advantages to doing it through those type of provisions. Lastly, let's talk a bit about opportunities and brainstorm a bit about some potential things that you could do moving forward to add more circular economy provisions to trade agreements. As I said before, multilateral discussions, plurilateral discussions, they're going to take years. In every context, it's going to take a long time. As I think we've shown, there's plenty of room under existing agreements, and I think there should be more willingness to explore what you can do under those agreements. But here are some of the things you might be able to do with respect to existing agreements and new agreements. So you could be more explicit in terms of provisions that allow governments to take circular economy requirements into account in setting specs, evaluating tenders. If you're looking to revise a trade agreement or negotiate a new one, you could explicitly say you can reference relevant international standards. And again, this is something where industries can go out and develop them. So I know that on the solar side, their efforts to develop a low carbon standard for the solar supply chain, and put that standard, run that through the Global Electronics Council process. And at the end result, then you have products in the EPEAT registry. For those of you who are not aware, it's the Electronic Product Environmental Assessment Tool. And actually, there's already a provision in the US federal acquisition regulations that says that procuring agencies are required to source 95% of their electronic goods from the EPEAT registry. As far as I know, that's never been challenged. So that's already there. But it also provides an exception in case there are no products that meet the procuring agency's needs. So you don't have to. And that's the great thing about these kinds of preferences, and that you don't have to say all products must meet this standard on X date. In many cases, those products may not exist yet. But if you have a preference, then you're sending a market signal that that market will exist for you. And the government is a very big, a big procurer. They're going to be spending funds to purchase these products. And so if you expend funds to meet these requirements, there'll be a market there for you. And you don't have to worry about an expiration date of the measure and wondering when companies will be able to meet that. If the preference is there, whether it takes companies 2 years, 3 years, 5 years to scale up, it'll be there and available. And so you'll be able to get the investment dollars you need to do that. But again, I think it's important to go to a standards body and develop those standards, because personally, I'd much rather write my own regs than have the government do it for me. And so if you can go to a consensus standards body, and there'll be government agencies there as well working together, then those standards can be referenced in procurement, like the EPEAT registry example I mentioned before. You can also include provisions that allow certain procurement-related local content requirements that promote circular economy. So you can do that as well. And you can be even more explicit about the environmental exceptions that apply to procurement chapters, and say it specifically applies to circular economy. Again, I think that's already in there, but if you wanted to do more, you could. Last slide, and I think maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later. You can leverage the debate on competitiveness and supply chain resilience for circularity. Again, I think you need to be careful about that, because you don't want to make it look like it's a protectionist measure when there are honestly great reasons for environmental purposes to do these things. And so that you don't need to justify them by any other means, but you can leverage some of these other efforts. And then I think you could also include provisions that provide a framework for more cooperation on circular economy. So mutual recognition agreements. If you're looking to potentially, if you're looking for friend-shoring agreements with trusted trading partners, you might have mutual recognition of domestic laws, standards, test labs, inspection bodies, certification bodies. You can collaborate on technical training to help the private sector gear up to meet those procurement obligations, because you want folks to be able to meet them as quickly as possible. And the other thing you can do potentially, and I think, and again, this is more of a long-term play, but I do think, the WTO is very interested in showing how it can help meet, how trade tools can be leveraged to meet UN Sustainable Development Goals. Circularity is key for a lot of the SDGs. The UN, there's a paper that the UN did, which links to SDG 6 on energy, 8 economic growth, sustainable cities, SDG 11. There's several of them. And I'm also wondering whether you couldn't have a trade agreement on trade tools being used to help meet UN SDGs with tariff provisions, standards provisions, procurement provisions, technical assistance, capacity building. Again, I think that's something that WTO leadership would really like. I think a lot of governments would like that right now. And that's something that I've been exploring personally as a matter of personal interest with several folks, and would be glad to expound upon. So I think that's it for me, and turn it back over to Mark. Thanks again for having me.